speakers, but sometimes we need a change. And also, there's sometimes when there's some material where it's better covered in a class style rather than just speaking about it. So this is one of those topics. So our topic for the weekend is representations and misrepresentations of Ashura and Karbala. What I mean by that is that when we look at the events of Ashura and we look at what happened in Karbala, there is a way that it's been presented to us. And anybody who thinks about it, there's some questions that come to their mind that, well, how do we know what happened? And the way that we are currently remembering it and commemorating it, is it something that was guided by the Ahlul Bayt? Have we been told to do this, or is this custom, or is it culture? What's all these things that we do, from majlis to niyaz to tabarruk to matam to etc.? There's so many things that we do in these, especially these 2 months or 40 days or 50 days. What's the basis of that? And the third topic that we want to cover, inshallah, is what was the aftermath, meaning that why was Karbala important? Was it, if Imam Hussein alayhi salam was killed, if his family was martyred, if all the shuhada were martyred, then how did it become a victory? So these are some of the topics that I'm hoping to, inshallah, be able to cover in this seminar style over the next few days. Today, our topic is how were the events of Karbala recorded? Meaning, how do we know what happened? Okay, and what are the historical sources of the events of Karbala? We're going to be looking at, number one, the eyewitnesses, those who saw what happened and were able to tell other people about it. And number two, we're going to be looking at what were the main texts, like the main books that recorded this. And part of this is, what I'm going to present here, and part of it is going to be homework for all of you. Okay, because it's a class, we have to have homework, right? What's the homework going to be? The homework is going to be that, well, once you learn what are those texts and those books that are reliable, then it's important to go and actually read what happened. There's a big difference between hearing bits and pieces of stories from the mimbar and actually taking the time to read the maqtal. Read it, meaning what happened from the beginning to the end. And it can be a very transformational experience in somebody's life to read the story of what happened from the beginning to the end. Even if you don't read the whole thing, even reading what happened on the day of Ashura, or maybe what happened on the night of Ashura and the day of Ashura, to read it and to know that what you're reading is based on authentic sources, it can really change your perspective. Okay, so the first thing we're going to be looking at is a basic question, that if the army of Imam Hussein alayhi salam was massacred, who was left to tell the story? Right? It's a pretty basic question. The people that were the most reliable people, like, for example, let's say Ali Akbar or Hazrat Abbas alayhi salam, they were martyred. So they couldn't tell other people that this is what happened to me. Okay? So how do we know what happened? And especially when most of the good guys were killed, right? So does it mean that everything we're hearing is from the eyewitness account of the bad guys? Like, for example, right now, if you were to, tune into Times of Israel, right? And you were to follow that to find out what the news is in terms of Palestine, right? Obviously, it's going to be biased. Okay, you have to, you can look at that, but you have to be looking at other much more reliable sources that are much more fair, right? So how do we know what happened, and are these sources fair? So if we go and look, we know that not everyone from the side of Imam Hussein alayhi salam was killed. Most of them were, but there were some that were spared. Even they were fighting, but they were spared for different reasons. We're going to explain a little bit. And there were some who were imprisoned. And even from the enemy's side, there were some who they were trying to be more fair and less critical and less biased. Okay? Now, how much they succeeded is a different question, but at least they tried. They put on an effort of trying to be neutral and just report what happened. Okay? Now, that's the eyewitnesses. Then there were, whenever you have something major that happens, people who have a conscience, they say that we need to preserve this. We can't let this disappear in history. It's very important for us that we preserve this. So there were people, many people in history who, as soon as they got a chance, they went and they started recording it. Right? Let's write it down. Let's teach everyone that we know what happened and make sure that this doesn't get wiped out of history. So those are the manuscripts, and we're going to be looking at what some of those were. Okay, so who are the people who were the most reliable, who narrated what happened in Karbala, or at least what has come to us, part of what happened has come to us through these people? It's the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam themselves. So there were 3 imams who were present in Karbala. Okay, there was Imam Hussein alayhi salam, there was the son of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam, and there was also Imam Muhammad al-Baqir alayhi salam. Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam was very young at that time, maybe 1 or 2 years old. Of those 3 imams, as you know, the first of them, the third imam was killed, but the fourth and fifth imam, they survived. So we do have some hadiths narrated from Imam Sajjad alayhi salam where he says this is what happened in Karbala. It's not the whole story, but there are parts of it, meaning that we know for sure that during his lifetime he would have told a lot of people. But in terms of what's been written down and what's gotten to us, there are parts of the story that come from Imam Sajjad. Same thing, we have parts of it that are told to us from Imam Muhammad al-Baqir alayhi salam. And even though Imam Sadiq alayhi salam was not there on the day of Ashura, he plays an important role in terms of making sure that people don't forget and preserving and saying that this is what my father told me, for example. Okay? Now, where are these hadiths that are narrated from the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam? If you're interested in knowing where they are, where to find them, there's a book which is called Al-Amali of Shaykh as-Saduq. Shaykh as-Saduq is a very famous Shia scholar, compiler of books of hadith. And in Al-Amali, that's where most of these hadiths are found. In recent years, they have been excerpted and taken and put into their own book. Okay, and it's like the book which has all the hadiths from the Ahlul Bayt, specifically about Imam Hussein and about Karbala. Okay, that book was made available in Persian language maybe about 15, 20 years ago, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's found its way into English, or it's going to be at some time soon. So that's number one. Now, we also have reports about what happened in Karbala from those who were fighting, but for whatever reason, they survived. Okay, so for example, we have Hassan al-Muthanna. Hassan al-Muthanna literally means the second Hassan. Why do you think it's called the second Hassan? Because his father was Imam Hassan alayhi salam. So he was one of the sons of Imam Hassan who was present in Karbala. I think there was 8 sons of Imam Hassan who were fighting with Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Hassan Muthanna was the only one who survived. The reason why he survived is that he got so hurt that he passed out on the battlefield. So when the enemy came, they thought that he was killed, and eventually they realized that he didn't actually get killed. Part of the code of war at that time was that if they found somebody on the battlefield who survived, they didn't kill him again. Like, they didn't try to kill him. That was just something that part of their customs at that time. So when they found Hassan al-Muthanna, they didn't kill him. And his uncle intervened, he claimed him, and he took him to Kufa. So eventually he got better, and he's one of the narrators of what happened on the day of Ashura. Another narrator is Uqba ibn Sim'an. Uqba was a servant of Rubab. Rubab was the mother of Sakina or Sukaina and Ali Asghar, and Rubab was the wife of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, and she had a servant. His name was Uqba. Uqba was captured on the day of Ashura, but when Umar ibn Sa'd realized that he was a slave, he gave him freedom. So he also told some of the events of what happened. For example, the story of Hur and what Hur told Imam Hussein alayhi salam, we have a lot of detail about that. That whole event, Hur coming from here, he's like shaking, he's like, the warrior, and then he comes. That's narrated by Uqba. Okay? And then we have others as well who, for whatever reason, Muraqqa, they were captured instead of being killed. We have Dhahak ibn Abdullah al-Mashriqi was a very interesting person. He made a deal with Imam Hussein alayhi salam. He said that I'm with you until it's clear that I'll be killed. And at that time, I'll leave you. So Imam Hussein alayhi salam said, no problem. If that's what you want, it's okay. On the day of Ashura, he was there, he was fighting, but it got to a certain point where Al-Dhahak realizes that he's going to be killed. So he goes to Imam Hussein alayhi salam and he says that, remember that deal that we made? I want to leave right now. Imam Hussein alayhi salam says that was our deal, but how are you going to escape? Because the enemy has surrounded us. So Dhahak says that I've hid my horse in one of the tents. I'm gonna leave now. So he did that. He got in his horse and he escapes. The enemy was chasing him, and eventually he escaped them. And even though he abandoned Imam Hussein alayhi salam, which it's quite something, right, to abandon the Imam at the time of his need, but he was able to provide this service where he became one of the narrators of what took place in Karbala. Then we have somebody named Hamid or Humayd ibn Muslim. Okay, Humayd ibn Muslim was part of the army of Umar ibn Sa'd. His job, he was paid to do this. His job was to report and to just record and to say that this is what happens. Because, if you think about embedded reporters, in today's world, right? They want people to be able to say with some authority that this is what happened. Of course, it's going to be something which is to their favor. So Humayd ibn Muslim is one of those who records what happened. And we see the reports particularly around the Shahada of Qasim ibn al-Hassan. And when the enemy soldiers come to the tents and they want to kill Imam Sajjad alayhi salam, you know how the story goes that Sayyidah Zainab comes and defends and says that if you want to kill him, you have to kill me first. That's narrated by Humayd ibn Muslim. Even some other parts of what happens on the day of Ashura, it's reports from him. Okay, so these are some of the people that we have who are the narrators. Now, so those are the people who were there. They survived. How did it come to us? So the way it came to us is the following. We had the eyewitness like Uqba, who watches and sees what Hur does. And then we have people who were considered trustworthy, Harith, they used to collect hadiths, or they would collect reports. So they would hear from someone like Uqba. And then we had historians like Abu Mikhnaf. Okay, Abu Mikhnaf, we're going to talk about his history after a bit, but Abu Mikhnaf was the earliest, or the first or the second earliest history of what happened in Karbala. Okay, there was one other book before him, which is called Tasmiyatu Man, I think it's Tasmiyatu Man Qutila Ma'al Hussein alayhi salam. And it's a very short book, but what the author there did is he recorded the names of everyone who was killed with Imam Hussein alayhi salam and those who were on the other army. That book was written around the time of our 5th or 6th Imam alayhi salam. So back then we had already, the historians started to write down. And then Abu Mikhnaf was soon afterwards, or around the same time that he was recording what happened. Okay, and so Abu Mikhnaf then writes a book which is known as the History of Abu Mikhnaf. I'm going to talk about what happened to that book, inshallah, either today or tomorrow. I'll explain what happened. Now, yeah, okay, we'll get there in just a second. So here, now, so what happens in if we look at the timeline, there's these books called Maqtal. Maqtal literally means like the place where killing happens, the killing place, okay? But it can also be used to describe a book or a text which describes the events of how people were killed. So we have, for example, the Maqtal of Imam Ali alayhi salam, meaning that how was Imam alayhi salam killed? Similarly, we have Maqtal of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. So in the 1st to 4th centuries, meaning that from the time of Ashura in the year 60 Hijrah, all the way up until, let's say, 300, 400 years, 400 years later, you have historians who are trying to write down and record what happened with chains of narrations. Then, in the next period, which is from the 5th to the 18th century, then you had those who would consolidate and make books which are more considered like history books that we know of today. Then we have a shift which happens in the last 400 or 500 years, where it's the age of storytelling. Okay, it's the age of creativity, and this is very natural. Okay, that in any field or any place where you want to improve and you want to make things better, you always are looking at seeing how you can make it more appealing and more accessible and deeper meaning. So you had a shift towards storytelling, which would create emotion in people, which is a very good thing. But sometimes what happened is that the information that was presented was unverified, meaning that it wasn't based on historically justified sources. I'm going to explain more about that and why that would happen after a bit. So this is just summarizing this. Now, we have, when you look at different books today, if you go on alislam.org, if you go on, let's say, Wikishia or some other website, or you go to some book collection and you say that, what are the books? I want to look at a book, a history about Karbala. Maybe you want to write a paper, or you want to give a majlis, or you want to read about it. Okay, there are sources which are reliable and there are sources which are unreliable. Now, how do we distinguish between the two? One of them is that usually the reliable sources are written closer to when the event happened. Makes sense. Or it might be written later on, it might be written today or in the last few years, but it relies on those original sources. Second of all is that there's clear unbroken chains that say that this is what happened. There's also a record of preserving it and caring about preserving what happened. And this is really important, it aligns with the profile and bravery and patience of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. Ahlul Bayt are ma'asum. Ahlul Bayt are at makarim wal akhlaq. They are the peak of excellence of virtues. If there are stories which make Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam seem like very plain, ordinary people who cannot do basic things in terms of controlling emotions or whatnot, right? Then we have to ask, well, where is this coming from, right? Could this really be the case? So this is where one of the ways that our great scholars, they distinguish between what's reliable and what's not reliable. Unreliable sources usually are written centuries afterwards. They use phrases like, it is said that, or some narrate that, but they don't say who said that. And they were done primarily to make people cry, or for poetry, and sometimes it shows the Ahlul Bayt out of character, right? As if they're panicking, as if they're extremely helpless, as if, na'udhu billah, they don't feel the presence of Allah in their lives. Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam were mirrors of Allah's perfection. They could not, Allah was more present to them than anything else. So how could it be the case that they would be extremely helpless as if Allah is not there, or they would do things which were illogical? Okay, now let's go to the earliest, maybe, or the second earliest source, which is considered to be the most authentic. It is called the Maqtal of Hussein alayhi salam, and it's by somebody named Abu Mikhnaf. Now, he didn't invent dialogue. What he did is he actually traveled and he met with people who either were there or people who heard from people who were there. For example, he met with the wife of Zuhair ibn Qayn, right? He actually met her, right? So Dulham, she had the whole story, right? She tells him that, I was there and Imam Hussein came and my husband didn't want to go see him, but I told him, I said that, why don't you at least go and listen to what he has to say? He's the son of the Messenger of Allah, and everything that happened afterwards. So he actually meets her and then he records in the book, this is, I met her and this is what she said. Okay. And even somebody named Tarima was another person who could have joined Imam Hussein alayhi salam, but he kind of was hesitant. He's like, I have work to do, but then, I'll come back. And when he came back, then it was too late. Imam Hussein had already been killed. But he heard from him, he met him, okay, and others. So his book is very interesting because it goes back to the original. Now, maybe some of you are wondering, is it available in English? Okay, so here's what's interesting about this book is that it was lost in history. Okay? But even though it was lost in history, there were books that quoted from this book. So it's possible that maybe 100% or 90% or 80%, it's very likely that most of the book we still have, but preserved in other books that were later on. So in recent years, our great scholars of history, they've gone to those works and they've taken out. They said that, what did he say here? What did this book, this book, this book? And they compiled it all into another book, okay, which in English has been published, and it's called The Event of Taf. And it's in my slides, inshallah. I'm going to show it later on. The Event of Taf is available. You can find it on alislam.org. And it is one of the oldest and most authentic sources of what took place in Karbala. I want to mention here that there's another book which is called Maqtal of Abu Mikhnaf, which it was called that, but it's not actually the same thing. It was something that was more of like a story that somebody just wrote, right? That has a lot of inaccuracies. And that was very famous, maybe up until 20 years ago, when there was a lot of work put into this. And nowadays people are realizing that, okay, there's that other version which has no basis, and then there's the one which is based on a lot of proper work which somebody can get access to. So what I mean by other books preserving it, for example, Tarikh of Tabari. Tarikh of Tabari is it's a very well-known book. It's many volumes. You can find the English has been translated for decades. It's very easily found, and many it's a history which is referred to by both Shias and Sunnis, right? He has many volumes talking about the history of Islam and Muslims, but one of the volumes is about what happened, at the events of Karbala. So in his book, he preserved a lot of the Tarikh, the history of Abu Mikhnaf. And then Tarikh Bal'ami is a Persian book, which is kind of a free translation of Tarikh of Tabari. And then Al-Irshad, which is by Shaykh Mufid, written in the 5th century. Shaykh Mufid was one of the greatest Shia scholars, and Al-Irshad is his book of history, which it has been translated into English as well. Okay, now, as I mentioned, there was a shift in the more recent years where the focus became more about storytelling, okay, which is not a bad thing, right? It's actually beautiful. The idea that instead of looking at it very dry, let's try to tell it like a story. The Quran uses this technique, right? So many times in the Quran, Allah will have a concept that He wants to express to us, and He'll use a story to explain it. The Ahlul Bayt used to do this in their lives as well. So it's not a bad thing that we're taking history and we're making it into a story, but there's a risk. And the risk is that in the process, we could be straying away from the actual events, and people might start to think that the story that's being told is the same as the history. And there's two different things. Okay, so we have to be careful about that. Now, one of the examples of this is Rawdatul Shuhada. Rawdatul Shuhada is a book it's a very interesting book. So there was this Sunni scholar, Hanbali, Naqshbandi, Maturidi Sunni scholar by the name of Hussein Wa'id Kashifi. He's considered a polymath, meaning that he was an expert in many areas. He wrote a book on astronomy and other areas, right? So he was also a deep lover of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, even though he wasn't, he didn't follow madhab of Shias, but in his Ahlul Sunnah madhab, he was a deep lover of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. So what he would do is he would go in public and he would give speeches and different sermons, and then as part of that, he would tell the story of what happened. But he was a master at storytelling. So he would tell it in a beautiful way, people would cry. And eventually his stories became compiled in a book called Rawdatul Shuhada, which is called meaning the perfumed garden of the martyrs. So even though it was a great contribution and a lot of people started to learn about Karbala, and eventually a lot of people became followers of Ahlul Bayt because of his work. Even though he was from Sunni background, a lot of people from Sunni became Shia because of the Sunni scholar's work. But he didn't observe strict standards in telling the story. So sometimes seems like he's mixing some folklore, some tales, and putting it in and making a story out of it. And then we have other books after Kashifi that introduced some things which are when we look at them, it's hard to understand where this is coming from. For example, one of the books is called Asrar al-Shahada, which was written by Darbandi. Darbandi was a very pious scholar, with impeccable. But in his book, there are things which we go back and we're like, there's things which aren't mentioned anywhere else. For example, that the day of Ashura lasted 72 hours. Okay, now, if somebody is doing poetry and they want to, let's say I'm doing poetry, I want to say that this day was so long, right? It was so filled with tragedy. I can say the day was a day of 72 hours, right? As a poet, I have that license. But if somebody then takes that and puts it in a book, right, and says the day of Ashura was 72 hours, there's a difference between the two. Or that, for example, the enemy army numbered 330,000, or the Imam Hussein Islam personally killed 25,000 men. This isn't found anywhere else. Okay, and similarly, a book that was called Nasikh at-Tawarikh. So when it comes to today, right, how do we know, right? We don't want to say that all books that are written in recent times are fabrication, but in fact, many of them have reliable content, but we have to be careful. And that's why we need to see who's checking to make sure where these stories are being sourced from. For example, in Abu Mikhnaf or Tabari. And that's why we need a process for checking that. So what happens, right, throughout history is that you have a poet, right? And the poet will, for example, they will say the example what I said, the day was so long, it was like as if it was 3 days, right? Or let's say, for example, that I'm telling a story and I say that maybe Hadrat Abbas alayhi salam took some water in his hand and the water started to speak. And it would say that, oh, thirsty one, why don't you drink me? For example, if I'm saying poetry. So I'm putting words in the, in the water. Now, as a poet, I can do that. But is this what actually happened? Of course not. Nobody who's listening to me is going to say that that's actually what happened. But people who appreciate like poetry and literature, they'll be like, oh, that's wonderful, right? We're making, more drama and we're making more profound by saying those things. So, like, for example, I might say that the sky started to speak, the ground started to shed tears, right? For example. Now, we do have reports from authentic sources that after Imam Hussein was killed, the earth started to shudder and these things, no doubt about that. But I'm saying that at times you can just start adding things and it's out of poetry. So what happens is that it's said, and then afterwards people repeat it, and then eventually it gets put into books, and then people start to think that this is what it is, and no matter what, okay? And we have to say this very clearly, that there are certain events that people would swear definitely happened on the day of Ashura that you cannot find in any historical sources. You just can't, okay? And some of them are well acknowledged, well accepted, right? So this is where we have to see what kind of people are we? Are we people who say that I hold on to every story that I heard from my fathers, right? Because I heard it from them? Well, that goes against the Quranic message. The Quran says that we have to think critically. Or am I going to be somebody who says that, look, I appreciate the love that my forefathers had for all these things, but I also want to learn for myself and learn and do that research and at least come to a good understanding of this is what we know and this is what we're not sure about. Now, let's say that there's something that's reported that is in no history book. Can somebody say then, therefore, it didn't happen? Right? Does that make sense? Can you say that it doesn't happen just because it doesn't appear in a history book? Yes or no? What do you think? No. Why not? Because there are things that happen that don't get reported in books, right? It could be something that was conveyed verbally, like from one person to another person, and it reached us there. So we don't want to say that, oh, this didn't happen unless we're sure that that thing, it doesn't match with the Ahlul Bayt and what they would do, okay? The second part of this that I want to mention here is something called Lisanul Hal. Lisanul Hal is when somebody, let's say I'm telling a story. Okay, for example, let's say that I'm telling the story of, let's say from Karbala, maybe I'm telling the story of Imam Hussein alayhi salam telling Hadrat Abbas to go get water. Okay? Now, there's certain things that have reached us in the books of history, but maybe it's just a couple of words or a couple of lines. So if I'm telling the story, I might add something. I might say that, Hadrat Abbas could have said at that time that, oh, Hussein, you've asked me to do this mission. I will definitely fulfill it to my last breath. I won't disappoint. Or, I might say that Hadrat Abbas at that time, he might have heard the cries of the children who are so thirsty and they're asking for water. Now, do I know that he did that? No. But I can imagine, given everything, that that's something that Hadrat Abbas could have done. That's called Lisanul Hal or Zaban Hal, as I say, like, for example, in Persian. Now, is that wrong? No, right? It's part of telling a story. But what's wrong is if Islamic Republic of Iran, and of course the ongoing atrocities taking place in Gaza and in Lebanon, and also now the threat in Yemen as well, and other places, we ask Allah Ta'ala to grant them steadfastness and courage and eventually victory. And we ask Allah to hasten the reappearance of the Imam of our time with the barakah of salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
يا حسين يا حسين يا حسين يا حسين Send me to Karbala, leave me there. Send me to Karbala, leave me there. Send me to Karbala, leave me there, leave me there. Send me to Karbala, leave me there. Send me to Karbala, leave me there. Send me to Karbala, leave me there, leave me there. Hussein, why? Hussein, why? Hussein, why? Hussein, why? صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. الله. السلام عليك يا رسول الله، السلام عليك يا حبيب الله، السلام عليك يا أمير المؤمنين، السلام عليك يا سيد المرسلين، السلام عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء سيدتي نساء العالمين، السلام عليك يا حسن المجتبى، السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله، السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن وعلى أولادي وعلى أصحابي وعلى 9 المعصومين من ذرية الحسين ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك يا صاحب الزمان، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.